All right, you joyfully miserable accursed. There's bonus joy and bonus misery today because this is Curse of Politics, the expanded edition. For the first time ever, I think we have 4 political strategists on the pod. You all know Scott and I, we're the semi-curdled liberals of the group. As for guest panelists, the whip-smart Kory Teneycke is here back again this week. And joining as the 4th punditeer, good friend of Air Quotes Media, former NDP senior strategist, current Canadian program manager in the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung Washington office. Always a tongue twister for me, Jordan. Jordan Leichnitz is here.
Wow.
Powerhouse panel. Here's the week's rundown. There's a new poll out today. It's similar to a couple others we've seen. We'll chew on it for a bit. The feds have announced they're dropping vaccine and mask and arrive can travel mandates. Politics, science, about time. What's the answer here? In the wake of the sexual assault threat against Pierre Poilievre's wife made by the founder of Diagolon, we'll discuss the political impact of far-right extremism in Canada. Our cursed clipping is Robin Urbach's Globe piece that poses the question, what's the point of the NDP? And Gordon Pinsent will chime in basso profundo to close the pod with our hey yous. Jordan, Kory, Scott, look at the goddamn 4 of us, eh? How are we going to make this 4 thing work?
My God. It's a balanced stool.
A very balanced stool. Yeah. Scott, there's just going to be less time for you and I.
I think that will meet with great applause.
I don't know.
All right, let's see how we do. There's a new poll out today. It's the 3rd, I think, to show the CPC with a 7 or so point lead since Poilievre's election as leader. This poll shows, this is from Angus Reid, and it shows the CPC leading in the West significantly, as you would imagine, although including BC, which you might not imagine, and close to the Liberals in Ontario and the Atlantic. 50% of men essentially voting CPC in the country, less than 30% of women. Men hate Trudeau, and like Poilievre, women are the reverse. Guys, dating tips here. If you're trying to impress the ladies, don't talk too much Poilievre. What do you make of it, Kory? I've been critical. I was not critical. I was observing throughout the leadership that the Conservatives were not getting the bounce out of a leadership selection that historically people have gotten. Now there seems to be somewhat of a bounce. It's modest by historical standards, but these days of gridlock, 7 points is a big lead.
Yeah, well, I think every party is dealing with that environment that you're talking about, where they have a higher floor and a lower ceiling. I think, so you're not going to see the same sorts of swings in post-leadership periods. I think that we have in fear to go back to the 90s or the early 2000s, but I think there's still commonality. The default towards male voters that Conservative parties typically have is there for Pierre Poilievre. That's not a shock. That Trudeau does better with the ladies, also not a shock. That's always been true for him. But I think what's encouraging is the growth in Ontario, and that's where I think Trudeau has a lot of vulnerability. And I'll inform some of that from time that I've spent over the last while doing focus groups, etc. Where there's something changing there. There is a softness, and I think the numbers that he's at are not at the peak of where they could be. There are people who are questioning their support for him, largely driven by the economy. And sorry, someone's trying to call me.
They're listening in,
and I think there's an openness to him, despite the natural hesitancy. Look, he has rough edges. He's has some of the traits that more closely reflect what we saw with Harper than, for instance, what we saw with Ford. One's more affable and charismatic, the other's a little more hard edged. Pierre's obviously orients a little more to the hard edge side. But there's an openness there, and Harper was able to get some of those voters in 3 elections. Not as many as Trudeau has been able to get on the female side, but there are women out there who are willing to vote for a Conservative, especially in the 905, and a lot of them voted for Doug Ford. So I think they're out there.
Yeah, but you've pointed out yourself that there's a difference in the way those two people present themselves. Hey, Scott,
Yep.
do you have a primal scream for the Liberals today?
Yep, I do. I mean, fuck, man. I don't know. Like, what's it going to take? A burning bush? I am the Lord. I command you to take action against this guy. He's for real. I'm so sick and tired of seeing this sort of patronizing pushback of, if I hear one more time that the Liberals aren't taking this guy seriously, we're taking him seriously. Really? Well, show your math. Show your work. Okay? So, to me, obviously, the moment calls for don't panic, but don't pretend. Don't pretend that the inroads into Ontario aren't significant. Don't pretend that the galvanizing of his base, that the scooping up of the PPC vote, that the appeal that he's setting for himself around economic issues. Don't pretend that all of that doesn't. It will just fade. That this is a short-term phenomenon. That it's a post-leadership bounce and so forth. Don't pretend that. There's nothing inevitable there. So if you want some things to happen, then you're going to have to try to make those things happen. And I would say this: I think that Pierre Poilievre has had a really good couple of weeks. I think that his opening stretch has been really good, and in particular, I think that for this reason, he's not once been disrupted. So I think it's good. He's shown discipline. He's kept it laser focused.
Aiken.
Yeah, that's a little, but I mean, really, not in any way that's wounded him for more than a second.
If yelling at David Aiken is a sign that you have a problem, well,
there's cross-partisan
for 5 years. He could probably throw a lot of barbs my way.
Yeah, I mean, I took out a membership, but I just think no one has tried to throw sand on his front step and make him slip. And so why I think that's concerning is that he has been able to define himself as he'd prefer to define himself. He spent a bunch of time building up a lot of momentum among his base and conservatives and saying, look at me, I'm this thing. And since he's become leader, he's been able to be quiet when he wants to be quiet, be loud on economic issues, not be loud on anything else. And, I think the prime minister has been equally disciplined to the degree to which they've clashed swords in question period. So I credit them for that. But I don't think there's any perceptible effort to try to disrupt him. And you can't let this guy define himself. This is his first impression. So wreck his first impression.
So, Jordan, one of the other tidbits in the poll was that Canadians thought that Poilievre and the Conservatives would be better at managing the cost of living, better at managing the economy, thought Trudeau would be better at climate change and in ensuring the social safety net remained. I don't feel comfortable with that issue set from a Liberal perspective going into an election campaign. We're not going into an election campaign, but if that's the way it breaks down, that wouldn't be good.
Yeah, that worries me a lot too. I think, and I hope I won't say this often in this podcast, but I agree with Kory certainly about the softening of voter sentiment. People are checking out the goods, right? And I do think that sometimes, we can make a mistake in discounting this period where we're far away from an election. Like there is a little bit of a primary happening here about who is best to tackle cost of living. And there's a risk, I think, both for Liberals and New Democrats, if it calcifies and people really have the sense that only Pierre Poilievre is the one offering those solutions. Now, thankfully, Scott, I think the New Democrats heard your primal scream. They're getting up and putting out negative advertising, against Poilievre, with or without our red team friends. So someone's doing the work. Which is critical. And I think hopefully is, a taste of what's to come. But for me, what was really interesting in that poll, and, I think, David, you touched on it a little bit, is that we are seeing that Poilievre has now scooped a lot of the PPC votes. So now we've got 3/4 of people who voted PPC last election who have shifted their vote intention to the Conservatives. And I think that's fascinating because obviously that's a direct strategy on their part and that's paying off for them. But it's also interesting to me too, because there's a ceiling to that, right? You've got those people. And what you need to do to get those people, I do think actually hampers your growth in other areas. So I'm going to be very interested to see how that plays out.
Well, it was interesting to see.
Sorry, just
Pardon,
because
what's that, Kory?
PPC goes down just because PPC goes down, a number of points and the Conservatives go up a number of points doesn't mean that they went from the one to the other. It's like we've spent a lot of time looking under the hood of the PPC, and there's only about a third of it that's Conservative. There's a third of it that's sort of non-voter fringe, and there's a third that are like very hostile to the Conservative Party. Like they're typically Green Party voters, tend to be middle-aged women. They're going to 4 yoga classes a day. They're gluten-free. They are exercising a 100-mile diet, and the pharmaceutical companies are trying to kill them and their family. That
sounds like me. You got to check your data.
I know. I'm just
if I was
describing you.
So then why court these guys, right?
So Kory, I was going to say
I agree, Jordan. To a large extent, why? That's not where the votes are. But I suspect why the NDP are running ads against Poilievre is because that's the votes he's hunting. That's where the growth is, especially in Ontario, for the Conservative Party. It was in the last provincial election. I think it will be in this federal election. It is hunting New Democrats in places like Windsor, and it's hunting their voters in the GTA even.
But let me jump in here, Kory. Let me jump in here, and I want you to end on this, because if you were to look at the poll if you were to say what's not encouraging in here for Poilievre is what appeared to be a very clear polarization around attitudes around him, in that Conservative voters were very excited about him. Like, they use words like inspiring to describe him. Okay. And he had very strong favorables among PPC voters as well, but almost no favorable impressions among current Liberal or NDP voters. So it looked like 37 might be the peak, might be the ceiling there.
He's has the risk of being Barry Goldwater instead of Ronald Reagan, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
He's like both are very exciting to the base of their parties and have a sort of an ideological fervor around them, but one is a little more hard-edged than the other and didn't have the ability to appeal to the softer shoulder voters. So, I think that's, we've talked about that before. That's his challenge. He's got to actually reach out and touch those people in a way that is maybe more emotive, a little bit softer, but without being disingenuous. Like, you can't stop being yourself in the process. Otherwise people just think you're a fraud. So it's a tough hand to play in some respects, but is there any other hand around the table that anyone would want, wouldn't trade Pierre Poilievre for it? Like, he's got the best hand at the table, but it doesn't mean it's without its difficulties.
Yeah. And Kory, he's got a trump card of a government that's creeping up on 10 years. So
right. Kory, I got a quick question for you, just picking on your Ontario expertise, which David and I lack, as evidenced by 2018.
Gratuitous, out of nowhere.
I included myself in the blast.
Not unearned.
We're not here to rewrite history, Herle. We're going to face up to our failings and our failings and our failings.
Well, you got to talk about the one before that, though, because 2014 was fucking brilliant. So
I don't think anybody wants to talk about 2014.
Well,
David and I have written a rock opera all about it, as a matter of fact. It's coming out soon.
You can't win all the time.
Kory, that gender gap, though, obviously it's worrying, but just to draw one more specific step on it, thinking about Ontario and the excitement you might harbor in terms of Conservative potential there, like, at the end of the day, isn't Ontario largely, when it comes to moving seats, it's largely about 905. It's largely about, and female voters in that sense are particularly potent, right? Because they'll change columns. I shouldn't say, I don't want to be universal in myself, but more likely. And doesn't that create some concerns for him, and that, talking about a very real ceiling?
Well, there's three. It's moving on three different axes, though. So certainly for reliable voters that might switch in the 905, the group that is most at play is who you talk about, women, especially sort of 35 to 55-year-old women are more swingy.
Fix that sentence.
But ethnic, I know, right? But younger ethnic males are also a group that will move, and they're the other big group, at least, that are common voters between Doug Ford and Justin Trudeau. Ethnic males very much switch. But the third, and I think the most important, and I think this is where the potential for Poilievre is the greatest, is millennials. And it's about them showing up or not. Like, they are the least likely of those demographics to come out, but they're also now the largest cohort in the voting public, in our voter universe. And he's saying and doing some things that are very appealing to millennials. This is why I think going on that goofy cryptocurrency show and stuff wasn't as big as a mistake as people in the press gallery and liberal strategists think. Like, he has made a concerted effort to reach out to those voters and to try to energize them, and taking some shots at the Bank of Canada, things like that. I feel
obligated. I feel obligated to step in as the millennial representative on the panel here. Look, most of us are pushing 40, okay? We don't give a shit about cryptocurrency. We're just trying to get a house. We're trying to make our childcare payments. Like, I really do think that this notion that millennials are, still, somehow 20, which is great. And I wish we were, but we're not, right? So the concerns, I think, are actually a lot more in line with the cost of living stuff. The other thing I want to say is that, even when it comes to Ontario, what Kory's talking about in terms of those blue-orange races, I think that that's true in some areas, Windsor, Northern Ontario, those are real battlegrounds. There's no question. But that has also always been the case, right? Like, that's been the case in recent history. This is not a new fight for New Democrats. We are very used to taking on conservatives in those areas. And I think that, the Tories are going to be in for a surprise if they think that Pierre Poilievre's likability has anything approaching what Doug Ford's does. Like, those are not at all the same leader. That is not at all the same connection with voters. And I think that there's a lot of work to be done before there's any sort of broad appeal for millennial voters there.
Housing is the number one issue for them. So you're right to nail that. But in terms of them being older, yeah, sure, they're older, like they're in their 40s, but they don't vote. This is like, look at who didn't turn out in the provincial election campaign. Look who turned out.
Don't we know all about the turnout for that, right? Like,
well, because Doug's so popular, why bother going to the polls? You're only going to confirm his supreme rule. It's elections that are change elections are going to have high voter turnout, right? Like, that's a given. This is showing all the telltale signs of a change election. Voter activity out there, you're, I'm sure, picking it up in groups and polls as well. Like, I expect we're going to have a high voter turnout number. That means, in all probability, a lot more millennials turning out, meaning issues like housing costs are going to be, front and center. Who do you think is going to bring your housing costs down? Certainly not Jagmeet Singh. Maybe if you're poor.
He's bringing it around for a rental subsidy right now, which is more money in the pocket than Poilievre can show.
Herle Burleyites, in this space, we've recently been to South Korea, Australia, and Sweden, the UK, Germany, France, and the US. Countries who are using evidence to make the most effective policy for allocating their spectrum, the radio waves that make wireless connectivity possible. But now we're returning home to Canada. Thank God there's no jet lag. There is, however, an immense amount of spectrum lag. That's what so many of our rural communities are feeling because they still can't adequately access high-speed wireless. In our presenting sponsor TELUS's view, that's just not acceptable. I talked about this last week. TELUS believes we should be driving toward a singular objective to put as much spectrum to use for the benefit of all Canadians as quickly as possible. But how do we get there? That's the question, eh? Accountability is the missing piece. Right now, an evidence-based performance measurement framework designed to report on the success of our spectrum policies does not exist. So that leaves the government with no real way of knowing whether its policy decisions are driving toward their stated objectives. The fact is, we are years behind our international cousins in our ability to adopt digital solutions to compete in the innovation economy and combat climate change. To that end, TELUS has spent more than a year now talking to the experts and gathering evidence and data from around the world. The models for what's possible here in Canada are out there, and they have a number of recommendations to make on how we can move forward, meet our goals, and make up the gap. We'll dive into much more on this next week. All right, guys, let's return to a favorite subject of this pod. This is something that Scott and Jenny used to literally rip each other apart over, and now COVID ends with not a bang but a whimper in Canada, as the federal government slinks out the back door, canceling ArriveCan vaccine mandates and mask mandates. Everybody laughed when Poilievre put out a video, or at least everybody in my circles laughed when Poilievre put out a video claiming credit for this. But surely this polling data has something to do with this decision. Jordan?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Look, everybody's tired of COVID. Everybody's tired of COVID restrictions. I think this was political. I think this was a business decision. I mean, officials even admitted as much yesterday.
Literally.
For example, that removing the mask mandate on airplanes was because, the airlines were tired of enforcing it. I think, removing the border, the ArriveCan, like that stuff makes sense. Like COVID's in Canada, it's circulating here. Those restrictions, I think, were more hampering than anything else at this point. To my mind, masking on public transportation is really a different thing. Like that's a very easy intervention that we know does reduce infections. So I think it was a real mistake to move off of that. We know that when we normalize this stuff and just make it part of our routine when travel, you do get a lot less pushback. Like we're all still taking off our shoes at the security, because some guy tried to light them on fire 20 years ago. So I'm pretty sure we can manage wearing a mask in between sips of our
Thank God the underwear bomber wasn't successful.
Yeah. Well, why don't we just end all that stupid shit at the same time?
Yeah.
Like, can we have a show of hands for who thinks we should stop taking off our shoes and at the airport? Like, I'm definitely on that.
Yeah.
And I also believe, by the way,
I don't wear underwear when I fly. So
not when you're flying.
No worries here.
Well, that's between you and the CATSA officer.
But also, if you can take down a plane with a pair of tweezers, that's more than 3 inches long, you can take down a plane without those because you're clearly, the reincarnation of Bruce Lee or something like. The absurdity of a lot of these public health rules or security rules, or they come in and they never go. So I don't know. I think we should have a little round of applause that we found something where it can also be removed and not just brought in and stay there forever, despite the obvious, ineffectiveness or, time limited relevancy.
Can I add an asterisk to that though? Because buried in the messaging of the government yesterday was something that made me just shake my head with despair. To your point about, we're just going to leave a couple things laying around here, why does the government feel motivated to persuade us that the ArriveCan app can be used for other glorious purposes? You know what? If you want to keep it for other glorious purposes, then fucking do it and don't tell us. But don't sell me on it. Like when you tell me the ArriveCan app can be used for other things, I tell you that's what your critics are saying. Okay?
Yeah,
that's the complaint. Right? Oh, you can file your customs declaration easier. Maybe. Tell me at the airport. Tell me at the checkout kiosk. Don't be so immersed in government-itis that you try to make this a pitch at the same time that you're canceling these things. Let me just talk against my own self-interest here for a moment. Tell you that we've got a string of like weird shit that we're going to use the ArriveCan app to do. Track your DNA, possibly, combine it with that of a long dead species. We'll see. We're going to work on it. We'll let you know. Fuck, stop. Anyway.
I do have a complaint to make though on the COVID stuff. Like, and I think it's worth talking about. Like, the reality is that as much as everybody's tired about it and it is a political liability around the neck of any government that's regulating on it, it's not over. Like, and it is still serious. Like we're looking at in the last 3 years, we've had 40,000 excess deaths in Canada. This is still making people sick. It's still hospitalizing them. It's still disabling people over the long term. It's still a problem. No and really like, labor shortages that we're seeing, like, I don't know, like my kids' class yesterday, there wasn't enough teachers. So they had 44 and 5-year-olds in one class because they don't have enough teachers. This is happening every day all over the country. And I think that there is a real failing on the part of the federal Liberals, and this also on the part of provincial governments, but there's a leadership fail here. There are things that we can do that we know work, like investing in air filtration, like HEPA filters, better ventilation. This doesn't bother literally anybody. Like, nobody can be against this.
The governments have spent literally hundreds, the Ontario government, hundreds of millions of dollars on HEPA filters for schools, for instance,
right.
More than per capita by far. But, I guess I think there's a much clearer political answer around this. The most vaccine hesitant demographic in the country are the same middle-aged women that we were talking about earlier. I think that the Liberals are seeing the same softness in those voters. I think the extraordinarily harsh rhetoric of the last campaign that he used to describe the unvaccinated was very jarring and abrasive to some of those voters who are typically Liberal voters. And I think he knows he's got a giant fucking problem with these people. He took the rhetoric to 12, and the cohort that's, he's probably, it's the easiest for him to hold on to and that he needs in order to stay in power. That also happens to be the cohort where you find that, the people who are the most uncomfortable with the rhetoric and the most uncomfortable with vaccines. So I think there's a simpler answer, and it's not about what Dr. So-and-so said. Insert the name of public health doctor, from whatever province or the federal government.
Well, I think there's also another simple answer, which is that you can't ask people to embrace a solution if you've quit tracking the problem. And so, we have no data. So Christ only knows what's going on. And people have quit bothering to disclose that they've got COVID. Other than the sort of tangible measure of, what's going on in our hospitals, which still seems like a bit of a jumbled mess. But now we've decided that that's a healthcare problem, that's a funding problem, and that's an administration problem, right? Like, we don't really know what the hell's going on out there. So it's harder and harder to sustain these measures, right? So at some point you just go, well, fuck it. Like, why? I'm not going to spend the whole day with Air Canada up my ass, and then jeopardizing voter cohorts.
There was never any clarity about what the objective was from the beginning.
Yeah. There's been a huge messaging fail with this, really, on the part of the federal government. And I think a real competence and management problem, honestly, on it. Like, we just, news out today that there's hundreds of thousands of doses of Paxlovid just sitting on shelves. So that's on the provinces too. But why is that? Why are we here at this stage of the pandemic? We've got these simple things that aren't divisive, that haven't been invested in this divisive and, polarized rhetoric that could be saving lives, and we're not doing them. And that's just dumb.
This isn't
not everyone was being polarizing, by the way. Not everyone was being polarizing. But Trudeau was the polarizer in chief. And I think this is one of the problems that he has. We've talked about this before. I think he's so far off his core brand. He's supposed to be sunny ways. That's, this is one of the reasons why he's more appealing. Like we're talking earlier, why is it easier for Doug Ford to appeal to female voters in Ontario than it is for Pierre Poilievre? Well, it's because one's got a harder edge, right? Harder edges are not great for reaching out to those voters. And during the last federal campaign and the subsequent sort of COVID waves, there was a whole lot of edge added to the messaging that Trudeau was throwing out there. And it's not surprising that if you do that, you're gonna have a problem with those voters that don't like that kind of shit.
He spent some political capital there. There's no doubt about that.
Can I ask? No. Can I borrow Jordan's brains on what I think is a related question, at least? Because when you look at this poll and when you look at these dynamics between Poilievre...
Scott's co-hosting the show today, by the way.
I have decided, yes. Thank you very much. Really, I think I should be... I'm Michael Che now. And
stepping into the breach.
This is the update desk. But you look at these numbers, the NDP have been creeping up slightly. Now, it's still it's 20, right? It's not 12. It's not 13. And... you see that it kind of gets beat up all the time as you're just being Trudeau's doormat. And they're struggling to figure out how do they take credit. They're going to get dental care this fall or some measure of dental care. And the implication is there. So be satisfied. If you want to crow about it, go ahead. And lots of at what point, do they look at these numbers and is this deal safe? Is my dumb question, I guess. My dumb, simple question is, how safe is this deal? At what point do the NDP and Singh go, fuck it, man, maybe we should pull the string on this thing?
Well, it's not the size of the deal, it's what you do with it, right? So I think ultimately that...
I hate that analogy.
Is this deal safe? And I'll take this opportunity to shout out to Nanos, who had us at 26. So, we're floating in not a bad place there. I think this deal right now is delivering dividends for the party. There's no question. Having a win at the start of the session on the rental subsidy, on the GST credit, on dental, this is significant. And the party is going to go out. Jagmeet is going to claim credit for this. We're going to hear a lot of whinging from people that he'll never get credit and that this is a failed strategy. But this is something that's going to be a bit of a longer game, right? Really, for the New Democrats, entering into this deal was about getting a bit of a governing record, about having proof points, about delivering for people, while other parties are engaged in bickering that Canadians find generally distasteful. So I think if that's the metric for the moment, the deal's checking the boxes. Is it going to check the boxes all the way to the finish line? Personally, I doubt that. I don't think so. I think at some point you will probably see New Democrats pack up their marbles and go home. But we're not there right now. Right now, it's doing what it needs to do. So I think that they've got every reason to continue in that relationship.
So what's happening out there today is not business as usual. It's actually a really long way from business as usual. In Eastern Europe, one of the world's biggest producers of energy and grain has attacked another country famous for its grain. That has upended markets, distorted prices, and supercharged demand. And guess which country, also famous for exporting grain and energy, is scrambling to fill orders worldwide? Yep, us, under pressure. Our sponsor, CN, is going flat out these days to move all the cargo: oil, coal, potash, forest products, and grain, especially grain. This year, Western farmers will ship 26 million tons of milling wheat that will eventually be bread, 6 million tons of durum wheat that will end up as pasta and couscous, 19 million tons of canola, which will be crushed into oil and feed for livestock and fish, 9 million tons of barley to be malted for beer or turned into animal feed or even made into beef and barley soup, 4 million tons of oats, 3.5 million tons of peas, 3 million tons of lentils. The federal government reckons the total crop will hit 75 million tons or more. CN's trains will carry much of it to seaports for shipment to markets worldwide. Population growth has morphed those markets dramatically in recent decades, and CN has spent billions, mostly out west, increasing rail capacity to meet the voracious demand. It's bought new rail cars, new locomotives, laid new tracks, opened up bottlenecks, and the moment it builds more capacity, shippers fill it up. In fact, CN expects that cargo moving west this fall and winter will at times exceed the railway's capacity. Meanwhile, export terminals in Canada's eastern ports, Thunder Bay, Montreal, Baie-Comeau, Quebec City, Sorel, Port Cartier, etc., are underused. It is possible to cope with these wild spikes in global demand worldwide. It takes a first-class railway network, and Canada has that. But it also requires balance and planning. The best way to get Canadian cargo to market safely and on schedule is to fully utilize our western and eastern supply chains, not only for grain, but for all commodities. It's pretty important. As I said, it's not business as usual these days. So, Scott, stop. You screwed up the order of this whole goddamn podcast now.
Sorry.
And I'm going to have to jump to our clipping of the day. We have a clipping today. Music, please. There. We have a clipping today from Robin Urbach in the Globe and Mail, which is on the subject that Scott raised. So let's go right to it. Robin Urbach writes, and the title, and columnists don't write headlines, so we can't give her credit for this. But the headline was, "What's the point of the NDP?" And the article goes something like this: what would Canada's NDP look like if it ceased to be its own distinct party and instead operated as a phalange of the governing Liberals? Would New Democratic principles, initiatives, and behaviors be perceptibly different from what the party is offering Canadians now? The Liberals have steadily encroached on the NDP's territory under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's leadership, on the legalization of marijuana, on setting a price on carbon, and on access to affordable daycare, on social justice, reconciliation, and inclusivity initiatives, and so on. The NDP will occasionally protest, hey, that was our idea first. Each time, though, they will yield that idea to the Liberals and replace that hitherto occupied space with nothing. The final forfeiture of the party's leverage and autonomy came through the confidence and supply agreement it reached with the Liberals in March. The question of what justifies the NDP as a distinct federal party should not be rhetorical. As it exists now, it is less an alternative option than an influencing force, a progressive nag on the Liberals' conscience that can influence policy but not present a viable or electable replacement, and especially not when it is committed to support the governing party for the next 3 years. Jordan, first crack.
I had $1 for every op-ed with that exact title. Yeah, I mean, listen, this is a tired argument. I think this is something that we see trotted out inside the bubble every, pretty much on a 6-month rotation. We heard the same concerns about when O'Toole was elected leader. Is he going to eat the New Democrats' lunch? Is he going to get working class voters? And we can see where that ended up. I really don't think that there's a lot to this. Ultimately, this agreement, and I think particularly the views of the chattering class on this agreement, it's a bit of a Rorschach test for how people feel about Jagmeet. If you like his leadership, you see it as something with potential for him to leverage. If you are inclined to dislike him, then you think he's a dupe and he's supporting the Liberals. I think the truth is going to be, it's going to be told over time. We have to see what happens. We have to see what he can exact. We have to see how he maintains some power and autonomy within that agreement. Is he able to continue to position the New Democrats to oppose effectively while still getting concessions? That's going to be the real litmus test. That's what I'm interested in seeing. I'm not worried about this. And most New Democrats that I talk to think that it's laughable that this week that John Baird had to be trotted out to talk about the conservative appeal to working class voters. This is old hat.
But can I just ask you an honest question? One of the changes Leighton brought to the NDP, is my opinion, my observation, was a determination to try to win elections. Right? Are the NDP still trying to win elections?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. No, and you're right that Jack brought in very clearly, he was running for prime minister, and every New Democrat leader since then has been doing the same. There is no change here. And I really think that what we're actually seeing with Jagmeet and this agreement is important and potentially advantageous, because we also know, and New Democrats who've been around a long time know this too, that a lot of progressive voters, if they really, really wanted to, if they could, they would love to mark their ballot for a Liberal government held to account by New Democrats, right? So what he's showing right now is that when you elect New Democrats, even if they aren't forming government, you are going to be able to get some concrete results. So I think that that's a plus. That's really going to be helpful. And actually casting ahead to the next election, and if we take Trudeau at his word that he's going to run again, I'm not sure he will, but that's a separate discussion. But if we do, I think that the idea that you're going to have Poilievre, Jagmeet, and Trudeau face off, those three personalities, those three dynamics is very interesting. And I think that it actually brings a lot to the table, a lot of potential New Democrats there.
Kory, you were shaking your head when I said, are they still trying to win elections?
Well, in certain provinces they are, but they're doing very different things than what Jagmeet's doing. Jagmeet, I remember after his first electoral outing as leader, dancing around like he'd won the fucking thing, despite the fact that his caucus was cut in half. It was, it was charade campaign levels of delusion going on there. And I think you're experiencing some of that again. Where the NDP win, and you know this, David, on the prairies in BC, they run a more centrist platform. They run leaders that have way more of a working class, blue collar sort of element to them, if they want to be successful. So, Oregon being a great example of that. Roy Romano, Gary Dewar, folks like that are a very different kettle of fish. They're not chasing, downtown woke progressives. they are chasing auto workers. They are chasing hydro workers. They are chasing people in the skilled trades. And guess who's being completely abandoned by, I think, the federal NDP to the point where they just sort of take their vote for granted, are those people. And they've lost them on values issues, and now they're losing them on pocketbook issues. They're telling people that, hey, we're not going to approve your new mine or your resource thing in Northern Ontario because of climate change. You should go work at a windmill factory. Oh, there are none of those there? Too fucking bad for you. They don't see themselves or their interests reflected by a party that used to be their party of choice. And O'Toole didn't get them last time. You're correct. But who didn't campaign for their vote? Jagmeet Singh. And if the Conservatives continue to campaign for those people's votes and the NDP continue to ignore them in favor of like downtown woke progressives, they're going to lose them there too, because they're losing them all over North America, all over Western Europe, in provinces like Ontario, and they're going to lose them federally too. It's only a matter of time.
I love the mistake. I love the mistake Kory's making here in suggesting that it's a zero-sum game between white male working class voters and diverse younger people in urban centers. I want to come back to that.
Well, no, because it's all the working class people in Brampton. Guess what happened to Jagmeet's brother in the provincial election in Brampton? He got his ass handed to him, as did in a number of the GTA ridings. It's actually working class ethnic minorities that are electing Conservatives in large numbers. So it's not about your woke values around that. It's more around things like value issues. And certainly we use this to great effect. Like we're not going to wear a poppy at Remembrance Day. Getting a little too deep in the BLM movement, etc. These are things that are not relevant, especially in an environment where you can't get a house. Because I think
Michael Balagas was referring to a little bit of that on the Hurley Burley last week about stuff that New Democrats have to campaign on, even though they don't want to. But Scott, you had Jack Layton's knife to your throat between 2004 and 2006, and I wasn't in there the way you were trying to manage that relationship, but I can't help believing that he would have been making this government's life much more miserable than Singh is in this circumstance.
I think that's probably right. And I think that it's an open question as to whether Singh will. To me, I hear what Kory's saying and I hear the debate. I thought this was a charity boxing match, by the way. I didn't realize you guys were going to just throw down in this fashion. But as much as we want to label everything as a brand new dynamic, and as much as we want to label, things to be, about failure, I think the NDP's challenge right now is success. And I think that this is almost an eternal issue for them. I think it was true for David Lewis. I think it was true for Bob Ray in Ontario. It was true for Layton. People cite Layton as an example of how using the leverage in the Commons to electoral success worked. I don't really think that's an accurate description of what occurred. I don't really think that those things.
Layton lost.
That's my argument, right? He took off in 2011. Years later, I'm not certain that those strings are connected. People like to argue they are. I think it's a very ephemeral argument.
Well, wait a second. Let me jump in there. He saw an opportunity, and this is the part of the NDP they don't like to talk about. He saw an opportunity to weaken the Liberal Party in a major way.
No question.
He saw an opportunity to deliver historic investments in housing, in childcare.
Oh, Jesus fucking Christ. Come on. This is a podcast about politics, not a learned lecture at York University. Jesus, Murphy. Look, I think they've got
the real outcomes.
But there's a perversity here for the NDP, right? Which is that I think their power in the Commons is increasing, but it's not obvious that pays off electorally or publicly. So you say, well, look at all these wins. I don't know that they're wins that anybody actually sees, and who gets credit for those wins is very much still in competition.
How are they wins? Even if they got
they have increasing.
I want to come back to the article, though. I want to say one thing, because I do think that there's a piece that we're missing here about the relevance of the NDP to the debates that are happening right now. When it comes to cost of living, at the end of the day, the New Democrats are going to be the only ones who are framing the issue around corporate greed, around business interests being responsible for things like the lack of wage increases that people are experiencing, profiteering and things like that. You are never going to hear that from the Liberals, and you're never going to hear that from the Conservatives. So I think that when we see people looking at pocketbook issues and considering the fact that their wages haven't increased in any substantial way in the last 5-10 years, and when they're looking and thinking about who's responsible for that, I think New Democrats are actually going to be really well positioned to be speaking to those voters that
hang on. I think there's a flaw in your logic. I think there's a flaw in your logic, which is I think that it's very easy for Pierre Poilievre to ape some of those messages, and we will, and we have heard them from him. And I think it will be very, very easy for the Liberals if they decide to switch gears and go to that. And this is where there's a law. The NDP are at risk, even as their strength, because these
Liberals
numbers
were going to do that. They would do it with grocers right now.
They should.
That's right.
Yeah,
and listen, the New Democrats are already pointing out in concrete terms the way that Poilievre has voted against people's interests.
We don't know if any of that's going to matter. You may fall victim to the law of thanks. There's the law of thanks for fucking nothing, right? And that's a real risk, is that you guys will pound away on this stuff, and as we get closer to a campaign, Trudeau will shift, absorb those messages, amplify those messages, and then people will go, my God, this is a hard-ass choice between hard-ass Poilievre and Trudeau, and you guys get swamped. So I think the whole alchemy is, how do you get credit here during this period for the things you say are wins, but I'm not certain are going into your column yet.
Okay, but let's jump in on whether these things are actually wins, because you guys got into this, or David, you did with Balagas a little bit. The issues that they're putting in the window, like the dental stuff, is so fucking niche that if you got 100% of the credit from 100% of the people who could take take part of that program, you have a thimble full of voters. And these are not things that are touching all of the people. For example,
dental and Scott and David know this.
But it's
dental
not
polls extraordinarily well, and this is going to be about
people who get it. It's
checks into the hands of moderate income families with kids under the age of 12. That is not a bad day.
I hear this.
It's too small.
I hear this from Christian Freeland.
It's too small to be a big political win.
Jordan stuff. But we have to. This is additive.
Dental's popular. Wait a second. Let me go, and then everybody else goes. Dental care is incredibly popular, Jordan. Right? And any idea to help people with dental care is incredibly popular. Right? These programs that are so narrowly targeted to small groups of people are so politically vulnerable. I hate them. The lessons we should have learned is that the social programs in this country that have broad-based support, that are sustainable, and that make a difference are universal.
Correct. So, saying dental is popular, and then saying we're going to give dental to a thimble full of voters and say it's going to win an election or change your coalition is absolutely ridiculous.
David, you're killing me. The good is not the enemy of the best here.
And you will not get.
It might be. I'm a little worried, Jordan, because to be honest with you, you're sounding very passionate, but you scare me because you sound like Chrystia Freeland, and I don't like it when I hear from Chrystia Freeland. I think to myself, jeepers creepers, she's peddling a baseball mitt at a hockey game, and I think their concerns economically are more broad-based and niche programmatic responses.
This is not enough. What this is about is this needs to be won in a broad series of things, and this also has to include, we need direct relief to people. Okay. We need money.
But you've got to squeeze Trudeau by the nuts.
Let's go to the next one. Let's go to the next one, which is we're going to give subsidies for rentals. It's going to help this many people. And it's off topic because what the people who were going to vote on this, and you did this great podcast on this as well, David, around the housing market, are new Canadians and millennials, and they don't want a fucking rent. They don't want a rental subsidy. They want a house. They want somebody to talk about how they're going to get houses built. And so it's like, well, we're talking about affordability. We're talking about a subsidy for renting. Well, I don't want to rent.
Walk and chew gum on that one.
Rent to own, properly packaged. Could be
layaway plan
messages and campaign and then hope to be successful. You need to have a few broad-based messages that actually appeal to a voter coalition. And the stuff is so narrow and so niche and so off topic. I hope the NDP continues doing it for a long, long time.
I hope that the Conservatives are able to have some actual wins that they can show people that they put money in their pockets over the next few months.
How many times have you pondered this question over your morning coffee or fancy matcha tea? Does Canada have enough shipping container capacity? Yeah, thought not. Well, I'm here to tell you the answer is an unequivocal no, we don't. And on behalf of our newest sponsor, the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority, why it's so important they build Roberts Bank Terminal 2. The Port of Vancouver is our country's largest port and already a vital hub, and it's only becoming more vital. Business and trade needs are growing in Canada. Marine container terminals link businesses, big and small, to the global economy. Just think about what's been happening these last couple of years with our supply chains. Connecting Canadians with the goods they need when they need them means scaling up before we run out of space, strengthening the connections between Canada and the rest of the world. Roberts Bank Terminal 2 will do that. And it's not just about delivering the much-needed container capacity. When it's all built, the economic impact will be 17,300 well-paying jobs and $3 billion in additional GDP annually. Which brings us to the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority. So why should they build it? Well, they've got a proven track record of building sustainable infrastructure projects and are a trusted partner to government, Indigenous groups, local communities, and Canadian businesses. I've thrown a lot at you here, and we'll talk more about this project in the coming weeks, including how it can help lower the cost of consumer products we all use. That's sort of important, eh? But for now, I just want to leave you with this thought. For all the reasons I just talked about, Roberts Bank Terminal 2 is the opportunity Canada needs. I got one more topic and we're so late. My God, this is fun. I'm having a goddamn blast with you people. This is a great time.
This better be a very universal question, David, or Kory is going to piss all over it.
It's not niche at all. It's not niche at all. Pierre Poilievre got up close and personal with a guy who's part of a fringe organization this week. In an interview, the guy casually suggested raping Poilievre's wife just as a show of power. Poilievre was quick to condemn it, but as others have noted, that he has not condemned the guy until the violence got close to him. Scott, what's your take, and what is the role of this kind of extremism in our politics right now?
Well, I'm worried that its role is increasing in its influence. And I think, you've got to be very careful. Obviously, when somebody drives up and says something like this, you have to respond. Pierre Poilievre did. So that's thing number one. Thing number two, and he responded appropriately in all of that. But thing number two is, if part of your ambition is to surface voters who haven't voted before, particularly those groups of people who are so angry and so pissed off and don't trust institutions, and they say, but your parade I might join, you got to be very careful, because if the price of gathering those people is to play back to them the bullshit that they believe, the lies that they repeat, and the conspiracy theories they traffic in, then you yourself are going to become associated and subject to those. And 100 statements like this will not eventually dissociate yourself from that. So it's a tricky balance that he's been playing. When confronted with something this explicit, he's obviously responded with explicit terms, and that's to be commended. But the challenge is deeper than just denouncing a statement of this venality.
Jordan?
Yeah, I think...
You've been working in this area a fair bit. I should note that you've just finished running a couple of conferences, I think, on extremism and politics.
Yeah, and one of the things that, bringing together global experts on this, hate and extremism, look, these guys are genuinely dangerous, and they're genuinely a homegrown problem. I think when we think about this stuff in terms of it being imported from the US, really, we're doing a bit of a disservice. They're a real security threat. And this isn't the first time that we've seen Poilievre cross paths with Mackenzie and with Diagolon, unfortunately. I think unequivocally, these guys are dirtbags. They are scumbags. They're horrible, but they've been that since the start, right? And I think what worries me is that we didn't see in his statement of condemnation, there wasn't like a condemnation of these guys and of that movement and of that fringe.
There was.
Well, it wasn't.
I think he
it
called
wasn't
them
super
odious.
explicit.
I think he
and
said,
when he
odious.
And when he got caught shaking hands with Mackenzie earlier this year, there certainly wasn't a strong...
Jordan, that's so unfair.
Well, let me finish. You'll have your chance.
Chooty.
The argument that I want to make here, and I want to be really, really clear, it is not to say that Poilievre is one of these guys or that conservatives are one of these guys. They're not. But what's happening that's really dangerous here is that these far-right extremists, some of them are claiming to be conservatives. And that is what I think really, really has to be strongly denounced. There needs to be a clear statement. There's no place for these people in the party. Because when we look globally at the growth of these movements, what is so dangerous is their mainstreaming. And so when they are able to use a mainstream political party as a vehicle to gain some broader visibility for their ideas and their movement, that's when we're in dangerous waters. And so I see this stuff, and yeah, it does really worry me. I mean, this is, and frankly, I'm a little puzzled by Poilievre's, statement that he didn't know who these guys were, like Daglon, 4 of these people were arrested in Coots with weapons charges.
Not everyone's trolling the dark corners of the internet.
But he is the leader of the official opposition. So, there's perhaps a slightly higher bar of information.
Two names if we're going to talk about people who have, wacko pasts and being made mainstream. Stephen Guilbeault, for instance. The number of people who have taken a picture with Elizabeth May, who are on the outer periphery of the environmental movement, is many, but that doesn't.
And if she was going to be the prime minister, people might ask about that, Kory. But
well, look,
I'm also not sure
and I think it's a little.
In the meantime, nobody's that.
It's such a cheap and cheesy drive-by smear, trying to say that there's somehow some hidden alliance here with somebody who is an absolute whack job, who Poilievre is condemning for wanting to rape his wife. It's his description of this guy being odious is absolutely correct. But where's the failing is not with the politicians. Now, politicians have lots of things to be accountable for around tone. There's all kinds of things that we can do better on around all of that. But when you're talking about actual extremists threatening actual violence against actual political leaders, whether on the left, the right, or the center, wherever they are, it's the fucking police's job to get involved. The police do not, I think, exercise good judgment in this area. In the United States, the Secret Service takes this stuff way, way more seriously than the RCMP, PMPD do with respect to actual, leaders in protected positions. And whether it's somebody on the left or the right or who it is, whether it's the prime minister, the leader of the opposition, the police need to step up and do their fucking job. And, it is not okay to threaten violence against a Canadian. It's not allowed. If it's a serious threat from somebody like this who has the means to conduct it and who is leading an extremist movement, he should be fucking arrested. I don't think there's any gray area on this. And I think if there's one thing that it would be nice to see, it's less of this discussion of, trying to smear one leader or another for being associated with this person or that, and actually come together and support one another and going after and having these people charged and dealt with and set an example of them to try to crack down on it.
Okay, but Kory, I'm not trying to spare anybody. I'm genuinely not. But you politically, Doug Ford, Premier Ford, took a very different approach to this in Ontario, and he made it clear to Ontarians that none of these fringe movements had any place or role in his party, to the point of kicking MPPs out of the caucus.
We had one guy who believed that Wi-Fi gave you cancer and the contrails were controlling the climate. He had to go.
Right. And instead of saying, well, that's just a weird view and I'm not going to condemn it because blah, 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 you condemned it. And you said it doesn't have anything to do with us. It's not part of our thing. So you obviously thought at that point that was the right approach in Ontario. This is a different approach.
I do think it's the right approach, but the context of the headline that you brought up that we're talking about is Pierre Poilievre condemning this guy in this group, calling them odious, and highlighting the fact that.
But it can't be out of the context of the fact that he didn't do that a month ago, Kory.
Well, he did. He just didn't do it as proactively as you thought he should. He did it in response to a question from a reporter as opposed to, running out with the rest of the Twitter mob proactively.
If you whisper behind your hand, it doesn't count. Like the problem here is that what we're seeing, and I got to say, like, it worries me genuinely from a very earnest protect our democracy place when I hear smart mainstream conservatives minimizing this stuff. This stuff is toxic, and they will take a much bigger slice of the party and you will end up being liable for really a lot of odious stuff unless these guys are pushed out. Like, we have seen what happens globally, and just like look at what, like, you guys saw the results in Italy. They have elected a straight up fascist government. Denmark, Hungary, like, this stuff is, we are not immune to this in Canada, and I do think that there's a bit of people are just a little cavalier about it in a way that I think should be pretty worrying to everybody.
Scott, you got a last word on this?
Well, I think there's a genuine philosophical but also practical debate about how much you can invite the numbers, the donations, the movement, and then say, but I will shut the door, and I'll shut the door loudly and firmly when that manifests itself in a vulgar, potentially criminal statement or action. Like, is there? Kory says there's no gray. There's no gray in responding to that statement, but there may be gray in terms of the cultivation of this kind of movement for one's political benefit up to and until that point. But some will legitimately say, no, there isn't. No, there isn't. Until somebody says or does something like that, then that's fine. Then they're welcome. And once they do that, then they're not. And I'm not so sure that I agree with that. I think that if you're saying, I've left the light on for all of you, then you got to be very careful about who walks in.
I'll throw out a challenge. I'll accept all the finger wagging and moralizing on this directed towards the right when the NDP bans people wearing Che Guevara t-shirts to their conventions, but we know that will never fucking happen. So, this idea of
these are armed militants. Like, I think we're talking about very different things.
Che Guevara was shooting homeless. And Che Guevara was shooting people for being homosexual and doing extrajudicial murder. So hey, but what are we celebrating? I just think there's a whole lot of hypocritical finger wagging. Can we not just agree that violence against politicians or threats of violence against politicians shouldn't be tolerated, and that the police should do something about it? Is that a good baseline?
Well, maybe, but it would have been nice to see that energy from Poilievre when the occupation was in Ottawa, or when Rachel Gilmore, Erica Iffel were being targeted with death threats and harassment. Like, there's been plenty of opportunities for him to make those sorts of statements about these people prior to this date.
And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for Gordon Pinsent. Assemble the troops.
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. The Hey Yous are about to begin.
All right, Jordan, this is our first ever 4 Hey You podcast, by the way.
Oh, my.
Well, I am actually going to have a bit of a sincere Hey You today, because I would be remiss to miss the opportunity to say a word about Bill Blakey, who left us this weekend. So Bill, literal giant in the New Democratic Party, former Dean of the House, 30 years as an MP, ordained minister, professor, and just a man of incredible integrity and dedication. So sending out love to his family.
Great guy.
As they mourn his loss. And we're going to miss him. We're going to miss his bagpipes, and we're all raising a glass of scotch to Bill.
Hear, hear.
Kory?
Oh, well, I can't top that. That's a great Hey You, Jordan. But I'll throw mine out here. It's to my friend Ian Todd, who's accepted the position of Chief of Staff to Pierre Poilievre. being the chief of staff to any leader of the opposition, no matter how bright their future looks, is a tour on the what is it? What level of hell? 7th level? I don't know. How
20th
how
at
low
least.
does it go? Yeah, it's right down there. It's not an easy job for anyone, and so I think anyone taking that job needs all the support and the moral support that you can give them. Hey, you, Ian, I know you're going to do a great job, and good luck with it.
Very good. Very personal hey yous this week. Scott, who are you going to say sweet nothings to?
Mom? I hope you're listening. She doesn't listen, David. She thinks I'm my hey you, I'm going to pick up on the Pierre Poilievre thing, but not necessarily in the way that, completely not in the way that Kory expects and will loathe. I want to pick up on a very specific aspect of his response. So forget all the other stuff that we've debated ad infinitum, and we'll have to debate again. Look at the statement. Look at the language. Look at the vocabulary he used in his statement. Okay, so he called these guys dirtbags, right? He
used their own language.
He spoke, yeah. So he used their own language, but he also used non-politician language. He used sitting around in the bar talking about this, CP24 is on in the background and 3 people are going, Jesus Christ, do you see this fucking guy and what he said and did? He used that language. And I think that conservatives...
It's like Jenny could have dictated it, right?
Possibly did, right? Or to be fair, maybe Pierre Poilievre himself.
Finland Falls.
But I think it's really noteworthy for how jarringly different it sounds. And it's, so we can talk about him speaking and being hard-edged and barbed wire, and I've said all that, but that vernacular that he's employing is part of the connecting to a crowd that has not felt part of politics for some time. And it's just a reminder. It's a very precise reminder in the context of a much bigger issue. It's a reminder that he isn't necessarily the same thing you've ever seen before. And, and as Trudeau and those guys talk about the GST rebate and they drench it in goddamn language that's almost impenetrable, remember that kind of language. Think about those bar stools at the bar and those stools at the coffee shop. That language is embedded there. And by the way, even as he breaks ranks with that broader group of people, he's still saying, I'm not going to actually surrender my connection with those who feel culturally shut out of politics, because I'm going to use this language to signal to them that I'm still part of that crowd, that I'm still their champion. It's a really important thing. I just don't hear plain language from the government. And they got to remember where they were in 2013, 2014, 2015. Think like an insurgent. Think and speak like you're fighting for power, not fighting to keep power.
Excellent. Couldn't agree more. So far, 3 for 3. We'll see how I do. Listen, liberal government out there. Nobody is affected more by inflation. Nobody reacts more politically to inflation than senior citizens do on fixed incomes and nervous about those fixed incomes. Food inflation's running at 10% and showing no signs of abating. Your affordability package does not specifically address seniors in any way. The latest polls are telling us that young people are gone, men to the Conservatives, women to the NDP. The polls tell us that middle-aged men are death on the Liberals right now. Get some money into seniors' hands to deal with inflation or watch the house fall down. That's my hey you. So, a lot of people to thank today. I want to thank Jordan for joining us and Kory for joining us and Scott for being here. It's a great group. It was a powerhouse panel. I loved it. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsors, CN Rail and the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority. I would like to thank my friend Janet Hughes for picking these flowers out of her garden to put in my view. And somewhat mysteriously, I'd like to wish a happy anniversary to Mina and Adam. With that, we'll see you all next week. Take care of yourselves. Come back for more Curse next week.